Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Shusterman Distinguished Scholar Lecture. This is the third lecture in a series dedicated to Gratz's new executive PhD in Jewish Studies, which has recently welcomed 35 exceptional doctoral candidates committed to mastering knowledge of Judaism and the Jewish people to elevate leadership of the Jewish community. The Shusterman Lecture is the realization of the vision of Murray H. Shusterman, Zichronah Livracha, a community leader who served for many years on the Gratz College Board of Zichronah Livracha, who served for many years on the Gratz College Board of Governors. Through the generous endowment established by Mr. Shusterman, Gratz is also able to host outstanding scholarly lectures for the community each year. I'd like to take a moment to thank his son, Robert Shusterman, and his daughter, Melissa Shusterman, who serves on the Gratz College Board of Governors. On behalf of Gratz College, I thank the Shusterman family for your steadfast support and leadership across the generations. Could not be more delighted to announce that our Shusterman Lecturer, Distinguished Scholar this year is Princeton University Associate Professor Eve Krakowski. Professor Krakowski is a scholar of the Cairo Geniza and social historian of the Jewish communities of the medieval Near East. Her first book, Coming of Age in Medieval Egypt, Women's Adolescence, Jewish Law and Ordinary Culture, uses Geniza documents and Jewish and Islamic legal writings to examine how gender, kinship, and rabbinic law interacted to shape Jewish women's coming of age and transition to first marriage in medieval Egypt and Syria. It received wide-scale acclaim in the field of Jewish studies and beyond. Her second book project, Written Torah, The Reinvention of Judaism in the Islamic Mediterranean, is a social history of early medieval Jewish writings, documents as well as literary works that examines how and why new forms of Judaism developed and spread across the Islamic Mediterranean during the 9th and 10th centuries. Professor Krakowski has also authored articles on issues including diplomatics, mourning and death, Karaite thought, diplomatics, and the social history of rabbinic courts. On a personal note, I would add that Professor Krakowski has been an invaluable mentor and colleague of mine during both my doctoral training and as a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton. Her brilliance as a scholar is matched only by her qualities of Menschkeit. Now, a brief note on format. Professor Krakowski will shortly be delivering her lecture, Death and Everyday Piety in the Cairo Geniza documents. After the lecture, we will have a brief Q&A. You can share your questions using the Q&A on the Zoom toolbar, and we will get to as many of them as possible. As always, we are recording this program and will make it available on our YouTube channel, where you will find a rich collection of past Gratz lectures and programs. Now it is my pleasure to hand the floor over to Dr. Eve Krakowski.
Thank you so much, Brendan, for that very kind introduction. So I'm going to just take a minute to share my screen. Okay. All right, so as Brendan mentioned, I'm going to be presenting on death and everyday piety in the Cairo Geniza documents, and I'm actually going to start with a will. This is a woman's will, excuse me, let me go back, written in Fustat, otherwise known as Old Cairo, Egypt, in 1143, that records the dying wishes of a wealthy Jewish woman named Sit al-Ahl, the mistress of the family. It begins with a standard opening for Jewish wills of the time. So the witnesses who heard her testimony state that they found her on her deathbed. We entered the dar, meaning the building, of this man, the pharmacist, the Alexandria, and found his daughter Sit al-Ahl sick and confined to her bed. The will then goes on to detail very elaborate instructions for the disposition of her property, the care of her young son, which I'm skipping over, and finally for her own burial. She said to us, "When the end overtakes me, I should be buried in this building that I'm in now. I will not leave it until someone from my family dies, whether my father or mother or brother. Then they may take me out with the one who has died, and in other words, bury me together with them in the cemetery. I want them to purchase a shroud for me, as I have no shroud that I'm happy with. They should buy me a dabiki wrap, a head wrap, a cloak, an outer wrap, a half wrap that matches the bed, and silk. It should come to 25 dinars, and the coffin 9 to 10 dinars. Muslims should perform the wailing." This will survived in the Cairo Geniza, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is a massive collection of medieval manuscript fragments and pieces of everyday writing that endured by chance inside a synagogue in Egypt, in Fustat, Egypt's first Islamic capital. So this is the synagogue as it looked in the early 20th century. This is what it looks like today. And this is just to give you a sense of what the fragments looked like, or may have looked like, when they were taken out of the Geniza before they're transferred to libraries. This is just a picture of a collection of unprocessed fragments from Cambridge University Library. The documentary part of the Geniza corpus comprises around 40,000 individual pieces of everyday writing, including letters, petitions, legal documents, accounts, lists, and many other subgenres. Most of the material, including the will that I just showed you, is in Arabic, or more specifically Judeo-Arabic, so Arabic written in Hebrew script. But the Geniza also contains documents written in Arabic script, as well as texts in Hebrew, Aramaic, and actually a vast array of other languages that are represented in small numbers. While the corpus also has actually quite a wide geographical and chronological reach, the vast majority of the material comes from Egypt and Syria during the 11th to 13th centuries. So basically the area roughly represented by this circle here, with the highest concentration of materials from Fustat itself. In aggregate, these documents give us what is probably the richest, densest, and most intimate look at everyday life among ordinary people that we have from anywhere in the world during the Middle Ages. The people who it shows us were mainly urban Jews, who, at least in Fustat itself, lived in a densely populated, mixed religious neighborhood situated around the pre-Islamic late Roman fortress that formed the nucleus of the Islamic city of Fustat. This fortress is still standing. This is, again, an early 20th century picture, which I'm showing you because you can see the church in the background here. And in fact, during the 11th and 12th centuries, this neighborhood was home to many Christians and Jews as well as Muslims. So this on the right is a map prepared for an exhibition on Fustat at the Oriental Institute a few years ago. And they kind of color-coded the religious structures in the neighborhood. So the yellow structures are churches. This is the Ben Ezra synagogue where the Geniza was located. But actually, there was at least one other synagogue in this neighborhood that is not on this map, and the green is a mosque. The Jews we meet in the Geniza identified either as rabbinites, so followers of rabbinic tradition as it had coalesced by the early Middle Ages, or as Karaites. Karaism is a medieval movement that rejected rabbinic tradition in favor of close interaction with the biblical text in ways that were deeply informed by contemporary Islamic literary and exegetical models. Beyond that, from the grand perspective of Jewish intellectual and religious history, as we know it from literary works, these Jews seem on the whole to have been relatively religiously boring. On the one hand, they were fairly religiously conservative, so on a day-to-day level, their Jewishness ordered many aspects of their lives, not just in terms of their social standing, which it also did, but I mean as well internally. For example, they ran many of their domestic transactions through a Jewish court system that operated pretty much in line with normative rabbinic law as we know it from the legal writings of the time, although Jews, I should note, also used Islamic courts. And the literate Jews among them spoke in a comfortably and ubiquitously religious idiom that drew equally from the Bible and rabbinic literature on the one hand, and from the Islamically inflected Arabic culture of their day on the other. Yet at the same time, if not for the Geniza, we would barely remember these people as part of the history of Judaism. This was not a population prone to high religious fervor or schism, so we don't know of any, for example, any major messianic movements during this period. And these people also weren't prone to great Jewish cultural creativity. They scarcely figure within the library of great Jewish writings that survive from the Middle Ages, with, of course, one extremely major exception, which is Maimonides, who spent his adult life in Egypt, and some of Maimonides' descendants. But I think this is the exception that proves the rule, because Maimonides, crucially, was an immigrant to Egypt from Andalusia, not a product of native Egyptian culture, and that is a distinction that mattered a great deal to him. He did not think of himself as Egyptian. And yet, even though I've just called these people boring, the Geniza documents offer us a richly saturated, granular portrait of their lives that in its very ordinariness turns out to be anything but boring. As I hope to show you in this talk, the glimpses of these sedate, seemingly unexciting Jews' mundane lives and thought worlds turn out to be both fascinating and often deeply moving. I am in the very early stages of gathering Geniza material that illuminates the cultural and social history of death and dying in medieval Egypt as seen through these documents. This is a subject that has barely been written about so far, and for which the Geniza offers an incredible wealth of evidence. So in this talk, I'm presenting really preliminary research on a few features of this material that have jumped out at me so far, that illuminate what I'm calling these Jews' everyday piety vis-a-vis death and the dead, by which I mean their unquestioned, ingrained, everyday ideas about what God and other human beings expected of them in the face of death. And each of these figures, each of these features of this topic that I want to highlight happens to appear at least in some form in Sit al-Ahl's will, the document I opened with. So I'm going to start with this extraordinary request, which I've highlighted in red on the screen. When the end overtakes me, I should be buried in this building that I'm in now. This request, this woman's wish to be buried inside her own home, flies in the face of rabbinic corpse impurity law. So let me just give a little bit of background. The idea that corpses pollute the living traces back to the Hebrew Bible, especially Numbers 19, which says that corpses transmit impurity, tum'ah, by direct touch. One who touches the corpse of any living man will be impure for 7 days, as well as by indirect contact. So when a man dies in a tent, all who enter the tent or who are in the tent will also be impure for 7 days. Even every open vessel in the tent will be impure. And finally, corpses transmit impurity even after burial. Whoever touches in an open field one slain by a sword or a corpse or a man's bone or a grave will be impure for 7 days. And then the passage goes on to prescribe a specific purification rite using the ashes of an unblemished red heifer to reverse corpse pollution. Leviticus 21 further states that priests, Kohanim, must avoid corpse pollution altogether, except in the case of their close relatives. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them, none shall pollute himself for any among his people except for his close kin." In rabbinic literature, an entire tractate of the Mishnah, Mishnah Ohalot, focuses on systematizing the principles that guide corpse impurity. This tractate begins like this. 2 are polluted by a corpse, 1 remains impure for 7 days, and 1 until the evening. Which 2? So the man who touches the corpse directly is impure for 7 days, and the man who touches him, meaning that first man, remains impure until the evening. And it goes on in this vein to present an incredibly intricate and gory graded system summarized nicely by this chart in Miriam Balberg's book, Purity, Body, and Self in Early Rabbinic Literature, that categorizes corpse impurity based on which body part you come into contact with and what kind of contact and how far the body part has decayed and so on. However, by the classical rabbinic period, and thus also by the Middle Ages, rabbinic jurists understood most of these laws to be obsolete, because without the temple, it was no longer possible to perform the red heifer purification ritual that the Bible requires to remove corpse impurity. Nonetheless, the injunction on priests, Kohanim, contracting corpse impurity remained in full force. Priests were not supposed to enter a cemetery or a home containing a dead body. This is a responsum written by one of the earliest of the Babylonian Gaonim, leaders of the Gaonic yeshivot, scholastic academies in Iraq, that set the foundation for rabbinic law as Rabbinite Jews in medieval Egypt would have understood it. He's writing here in the 9th century. A Kohen who enters a house containing a corpse in our time or a cemetery, you ask, do they lash him or not? And the answer is, since his holiness is permanent, even in our time, meaning it outlasts the destruction of the temple, he transgresses a prohibition and deserves lashes. So from a rabbinite legal perspective, Sit al-Ahl's request to be buried inside her home is hard to understand. People of this class in Fustat typically lived in large, multi-part courtyard buildings called dars. This is a speculative illustration prepared by a scholar named Matthew Harrison based on the foundations of houses that have been excavated from Fustat, but a dar like this would have been more than just this story. And I'm showing it to you in order to illustrate that these buildings were carved up into many little different apartments where lots of different people lived, not all of them relatives, and where visitors were constantly coming and going. It is almost unthinkable that a Jewish man who happened to be a Kohen would not have entered this building at some point and thus rendered himself culpable of a rabbinic legal transgression. But nobody writing this will or involved in its production, which, this is a will produced by people involved in the rabbinic court of Fustat, they don't seem worried about that. And this is not a one-off. So I'm going to show you just a couple of other documents illustrating the same point. This is a death report from 1105 describing a man who died alone in his home on the Sabbath. So the witnesses state, we entered, we who sign below, together with those mentioned here, on Sunday, the 13th of Tevet, 1105, to the place in which Yosef ben Ismail al-Buni was living after we learned that he had died recently on the Sabbath day. And then it goes through a whole list of men who were present and attended to his death. And then it says that they stood at the door of the room, which was locked. They opened it. They had the washers bring the corpse out to the courtyard, and he was dead and nude. And of course, I'm showing this to you because of this name that I've marked in red here. The document identifies one of these men as a Kohen. But again, nobody seems to care that he is one of the people coming to attend closely to this corpse. In fact, I have found only one Geniza document where people do seem worried about this issue, and it is quite literally an exception that proves the rule. This is a document from Jerusalem, not Egypt. It's an incredibly interesting letter, written maybe in the 1060s, that describes the death of a woman named Sitat. After all this, Sitat died, the wife of Rav Natan, the sister of Awad. She died on Simchat Torah night and remained unburied for 2 days because of the situation that my Lord knows, meaning the person he's writing to knows. Namely, that since the day of our Lord the Nasi, the head of the yeshiva, we've not been permitted to bring the body through Dar Jama'ah. So this is a previous funeral when this communal leader died, at which point the Jews were forbidden from passing through this place. We were told you can't pass through from there unless you pay 2 dinars for every corpse. We said, from where should we travel? They said from Zion Gate or Silwan Gate from outside the city. But if we buried from these places, when we accompanied the dead, it would be a humiliation and a mockery because of the stoning and abuse. So just to give a little bit of context, we actually do not know what the Dar Jama'ah, literally this means community building, is, this place that they originally wanted to go through. But if we are looking at the old city of Jerusalem, Zion Gate and Silwan Gate, which is what is now called the Dung Gate, are located here and here. So presumably they were being told to go through one of these 2 gates because the cemetery was located somewhere down here below the city. Okay, so what happens next? When the dead woman died, because of all of this, we said we'll bury her in the building or in one of the 2 stores with her merchandise. So basically, we have a situation where the Jews in Jerusalem are being fined for going to the cemetery, to the Jewish cemetery, the way they usually do. They're afraid that if they go through the city gates, the funeral procession is going to be subjected to abuse. And so they decide they're just going to bury her inside a building or a store. Then it says, there were troubles and tribulations, and a great trembling overtook us because of this. So we gave a bribe and brought her out at night to the Samaritika, and the community gathered there. We brought her out to the tombs from Samaritika, weeping and wailing. We are not sure where that place is either, but scholars think it's around here, which is logical given the geography where we've already looked at. So, of course, I'm showing you this document because, again, of these lines I've marked in red, which describe these people deciding to bury this woman in a house or a store that people will be coming and going in, but then getting cold feet. There were troubles and tribulations, and a great trembling overtook us because of this. In other words, some unspecified calamity spooked them into facing the fact that this would be rabbinically problematic, and they buried her in the cemetery instead. So far, it may seem like what I have been talking about is simply everyday impiety among Jews in medieval Egypt, right? It seems maybe like these people just did not care about rabbinic law. However, I would suggest that there is something else going on here. These documents consistently also express another positive value that itself has deep resonances both in classical rabbinic tradition and in Islamic legal approaches to the dead, and that in some respects is conceptually at odds with the whole idea of corpse impurity, namely a deep investment in providing honor and in some sense even comfort to the dead themselves. In fact, already in classical rabbinic literature, this theme figures more prominently than the theme of corpse impurity. If we go back to Ohalot, this extensive discussion about decaying corpses that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, this tractate in the Mishnah is basically a closed textual bubble. The corpses it describes have no real world context at all. So, for all of its conceptual complexity and detail, Ohalot really does not tell us much about actual death practices among Jews in late antiquity. And remarkably, when we move beyond Ohalot, rabbinic texts do not have that much to say about corpse impurity, especially when we compare that topic to other purity practices that are actually extra biblical, about which it says plenty, such as hand washing before eating or pollution from holy books. In marked contrast, rabbinic literature is absolutely filled with discussions of other aspects of the treatment of corpses that mainly focus on their care. So to give you just a few examples, this is from Mishnah Shabbat. They may fulfill all of the dead's needs, meaning on the Sabbath. They may oil and rinse it as long as they don't, as long as they don't move any of its limbs. They may take the mattress out from under it and place it on sand in order to stay it. And the rinsing that this text is talking about does not seem to be ritual washing. And I should note that the tahara of corpses that we are familiar with today is a much later practice, later even than the Geniza material, and it's not what the Mishnah is talking about here. Rather, this passage is talking about beautification for the sake of the corpse's dignity or honor. And that is explicit in other sources. So, for example, this is from Mishnah Sanhedrin. Anyone who leaves his dead unburied overnight transgresses a prohibition, but if he left him unburied to honor him, to bring him a coffin and shrouds, he doesn't transgress. Remarkably, a Braita cited in the Babylonian Talmud says one whose dead lies before him eats in another room. If he has no other room, he eats at his friend's house. If he has no friend's house, he makes a mechitza, a divider. If he has nothing with which to make a divider, he turns his face to the side and eats. So we might think that this is about purity, right? That eating in the presence of the corpse maybe raises purity concerns, but it really doesn't seem that way, especially from the last line that he turns his head and eats. Rather, this seems to be about not behaving coarsely or frivolously in the presence of the dead, almost like an issue of not shaming them. Commenting on the middle passage here about leaving the dead unburied, the Babylonian Talmud debates whether such laws are for the sake of the living or the dead, and it seems to favor the view that they are for the living. And yet, interestingly, there are other rabbinic passages that suggest a very strong version of the opposite view, meaning these laws are for the sake of the dead themselves. And some of these passages even suggest that the dead retain some form of consciousness in the grave that demands consideration from the living. A long, extraordinary passage in the Talmud begins, "A man may not walk in a cemetery with tefillin on his head and a Torah scroll on his arm reading from it. If he does this, he transgresses the verse, who mocks the poor blasphemes his maker." So in other words, doing this in the graveyard is a way of mocking the dead who are poor in the sense that they can no longer do these things. They can no longer wear tefillin or carry a Torah scroll. Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yonatan were carrying and walking in a cemetery. Rabbi Yochanan's tchelta came untied on a grave. Rabbi Chia said, "Lift it up, that they should not say, 'Tomorrow they will come among us, but now they mock us.'" Meaning the dead should not say, "Tomorrow these living people will come join us in the grave, but now they're mocking us." And this text goes on to describe in some detail the dead feeling both physical suffering and awareness in the grave of what the living around them are doing. So that's some context from the rabbinic end. Islamic legal texts reflect similar impulses. This is a wonderful book on early Islamic burial practices titled Muhammad's Grave, written by Lior Halevi, which argues that in general, Islamic law was concerned less with the effects of the dead on the living than with the effects of the living on the dead. Halevi shows that while early Islamic legal sources do discuss living people needing to wash after they touch a corpse out of purity concerns, these sources quickly come to reflect ambivalence about this. As, for example, in this early hadith, this early Islamic legal narrative situated in Medina. Asma bint Umais, the wife of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, washed him when he died. Then she went out and asked, "I'm fasting and it's very cold, so do I have to do a major ablution, meaning a major ritual washing?" And she's told no. Eventually, the idea that such ablutions were necessary was rejected altogether. So that view kind of dies out. And in contrast, Islamic legal sources do universally presume that corpses need to be washed, again, not so much for their purity as for their dignity. And these sources are much more concerned with how to do this properly for the corpse's sake than for the sake of the living. So Islamic jurists emphasize safeguarding the corpse's modesty. For example, there's a whole discussion that Halevi describes about whether husbands and wives remain married after death, such that a husband can wash his wife's corpse without violating her modesty. Or to give another example, which I've cited here on the screen, he says some jurists considered it repugnant for menstruating women or for men contaminated by traces of sex to wash corpses. Also, like the rabbis of late antiquity, Islamic sources discuss the corpse's continued consciousness after death in a state that Islamic literature terms al-barzakh. This topic is much more elaborated in Islamic sources than in rabbinic ones. And just to give you one tiny example tied to the topic of washing, Halevi cites an early tradition that, quote, the dead knows who washes him. The Geniza documents that I have shown you, in which people seem not to worry very much about corpse impurity, do reflect a deep investment in this bundle of values that both rabbinic and Islamic texts share in different ways, centered on honoring and tending to the dead body. So, in this account from Jerusalem that we looked at, the impulse to bury Sitat in her house comes from a desire to avoid subjecting her corpse to humiliation and mockery from jeering crowds as her funeral procession passed by, right? When we accompanied the dead, if we left from these gates, it would be a humiliation and a mockery because of non-Jews, probably in this context Muslims, stoning and yelling abuse at the corpse. Likewise, Sit al-Ahl's wish to be buried at home comes from her fear of her own loneliness after death. She wants to not be physically alone in the grave, but to be kept together with her birth relatives, right? She says, I will not leave until someone else from my family dies, either my father, my mother, my brother, then they can take me out with that person and bury us together. These two examples emphasize honoring and cherishing the dead, making sure they're not lonely. Many other Geniza documents reflect a similar emphasis on the physical adornment of the bed. So corpses were not only washed by professional corpse washers, but often dressed in the most beautiful, expensive clothing available. This is, of course, a very striking element of this will. I want them to purchase a shroud for me, as I have no shroud that I'm happy with, right? She doesn't like anything in her closet, so she wants to go shopping. And then she goes through these many, many different layers of expensive clothing that she wants purchased for a total cost of 25 dinars and then another 9 to 10 for the coffin. So just to put this in context, S.D. Goitein, the founding father of Geniza's social history, estimated that a, quote, middle-class family in Fustat could live on 2 dinars a month. 25 dinars, which she's asking to have spent on her shrouds, was a very respectable dowry. So this is an exceptional amount to spend on shrouds, but many other Geniza documents describe the enormous attention that men and women alike paid to preparing beautiful clothing to wear in the grave. And I should note that this was in no way a practice unique to Jews. In fact, the dead supply a lot of what we know about clothing in medieval Egypt generally, because most of the textiles that we have from this period come from tombs. Some of them are beautifully embroidered tiraz textiles, including inscribed robes of honor that were given as gifts to high-ranking important men by caliphs. This is a Fatimid example from the late 10th century that names the Caliph al-Aziz. These would have been the most precious possessions of the men who received them that they then chose to wear in depth. And while most such textiles made their way to the antiquities market without detailed documentation, so we don't usually know what they actually looked like in the grave, a rare find from Fustat, described in this beautiful book, Social Fabrics, Inscribed Textiles from Medieval Egyptian Tombs, corroborates the descriptions that we find in Geniza documents of corpses wearing many elaborate layers of fine clothing. So this man was wrapped in a sequence of inscribed tiraz shrouds, and actually not one, but 2 of them were caliphal tiraz robes. So Jews would not have worn caliphal tiraz, but here is an example of a non-inscribed fragment of tiraz as well. Okay. Thomas Lacour's magnificent cultural history of corpses in Europe, The Work of the Dead, opens by noting that the dead body matters everywhere. It matters in disparate religious and ideological circumstances. It matters across all sorts of belief about an afterlife or a god. It matters in the absence of such belief. There seems to be a universally shared feeling not only that there is something deeply wrong about not caring for the dead body in some fashion, but that the uncared for body, no matter the cultural norms, is unbearable. Lacour here means care in the sense of just doing something with the body, often something involving ritual, whether the body is cremated or buried or ritually exposed, as among Zoroastrians in late antiquity. I'm suggesting that for Jews in medieval Egypt, the dead body mattered primarily as an object of literal care. Above all, dead bodies required honor, protection, and even emotional comfort. Medieval Egyptian Jews seem to have had a deep sense of what Lacour elsewhere in this book terms the dead's persistence of being, a sense that the dead remained part of a human community even in the grave. This approach has roots in late ancient rabbinic literature, where it stands in some tension with the legacy of biblical purity law. On the ground, in the 11th and 12th centuries, this orientation may perhaps help explain Geniza people's seemingly near complete unconcern about corpse impurity. Despite Egyptian Jews' mainly uncomplicated investment in rabbinic practices, this profound sense of obligation to the dead may not have left much room for the kind of protective containment that underlies all corpse impurity practices, which seek, conversely, to guard the living from the dead. Before I move on from the topic of dead bodies, which I will do soon, I want to note one last interesting aspect of this woman's burial request. She asks to eventually be reburied in the cemetery, right? Then they may take me out with the one who has died. Secondary burial, in which the corpse is first temporarily buried or enshrouded and set aside in a chamber like this one at Beit Sha'arim, and then once the flesh has decayed, the bones are reburied or placed in an ossuary like this one, was a common Jewish practice in antiquity during the late Hellenistic and early Roman periods. In contrast, secondary burials were not typical in the medieval Near East, and to my knowledge, there has been very little attention paid to the possibility that secondary burial was also an occasional Jewish practice during the Middle Ages. But in fact, this will is not the only Geniza document to describe a Jewish secondary burial. A small handful of other documents, so far I am aware of 10, describe the relocation of a corpse's bones, not to a local cemetery as in this case, but specifically to Jerusalem. For example, this is a woman's will written in Hebrew in Fustat in 1006, asking that an enormous money, the equivalent of 2 portions of a building, should be spent in order to bring up my bones to Jerusalem. And since this is in Hebrew, I have excerpted it for you here. Kedei lehalot asmotai liYerushalayim. The Jewish practice of reinterment in the land of Israel also has ancient roots. The Hebrew Bible famously describes the Israelites bringing their patriarch Joseph's bones out of Egypt and into the land of Israel, where they were buried in Shechem, and Joseph's bones, which the children of Israel had brought up from Egypt, they buried in Shechem. And in fact, this will is actually using the same verb, probably in a direct echo of this verse. In late antiquity, secondary burials of diaspora Jews who had their bones sent to Palestine are attested in many classical rabbinic sources, which, as Isaiah Gaffney has noted, give 2 explanations for the practice. First, burial in the land of Israel atones for sin, and second, those buried in the land of Israel will be the first to be resurrected when the Messiah comes. These Geniza documents describing this practice demonstrate that it remained alive and well, no terrible pun intended, sorry, among Jews in medieval Egypt. I'm going to shift topics now and close the talk by turning to a different theme, which is represented in the very last line I've put on the slide here of this will: Muslims should perform the wailing. Namely, I'm going to end by discussing how Geniza documents represent the grief of the bereaved. So I will come back to these Muslim wailers, but first let's start with this condolence letter. Sent around the turn of the 12th century by Avraham ben Natan, the Av HaYeshiva, one of the heads of the Palestinian Gaonic Yeshiva in Jerusalem, to another Jewish communal leader, probably in Fustat. It begins with a verse from Ecclesiastes in Hebrew. For the king's word has dominion. Who will say to him, what do you do? The letter then continues in Judeo-Arabic with a very brief address to the recipient, a Kohen and Parnas and court trustee, whose name unfortunately is effaced. That's this little hole over here. Followed by a searing description of Abraham's own grief at the recent death of a woman, possibly the recipient's wife, but it's not clear. That which I must send and that which I must not delay, of the grief that has descended suddenly upon you. Your sorrow has disordered my heart and set it on fire. From your distress, my intellect is almost none, my mind has fled. Sighs and groans overtake me for the mother of the orphan. May God have mercy on him. The matter took me to a state I cannot describe and can't control. I've gone on my way aimlessly, destroyed like a wanted man, until I came to my senses, withdrew from the drunkenness, if not from the calamities. He doesn't mean literal drunkenness, he means the kind of stupor he was in, and return to the Creator may he be exalted, thankful and steadfast, as it says, citing the verse about Aaron's response to the death of his sons, and Aaron was silent. This is one of hundreds of condolence and mourning letters preserved in the Geniza that capture a rich and sprawling discourse about grief among Jews in medieval Egypt. Remarkably, these letters are not at all formulaic. I should note that we also do have formulas, model templates, as well as actual examples of eulogies that survived in the Geniza, which are mainly in Hebrew and do tend to be pretty generic. But in contrast, the Judeo-Arabic condolence letters like this one are extremely diverse, both in their length and in the idioms that they use. Still, despite this variety, they reflect a basic stock of common themes. Specifically, they tend to contain 3 core motifs, all of which appear in this letter, and I have color-coded them here on the screen. First, they typically include some reference to the letter writer's obligation to console the mourner. So that's what this kind of awkward sentence here is, that which I must send and that which I must not delay, meaning this letter itself, which it is my duty to send you right away. Second, they contain an account of the letter writer's grief, and that's this very eloquent passage here that I've put in pink. And then finally, they contain some kind of exhortation to control that grief, which is always expressed in terms of submission or return to God, right? I return to the Creator, thankful and steadfast. Quoting this verse about restraint, and Aaron was silent, and that is also, of course, the theme of the incipit here from Ecclesiastes. The king's word has dominion. Who will rebuke him? Who will say to him, what do you do? Like the notion that the dead require tending, these thematic responses to death have a very long history in Near Eastern epistolary culture. In fact, they appear in older condolence letters preserved from Egypt in languages ranging from Greek to Coptic to Arabic, both before the Christianization of the Near East and after it, and before the Islamicization of the Near East and after it. And I'm going to show you just a few examples. So this is a 2nd century letter in Greek written before the Christianization of the Near East. It includes a reference to the letter writer's grief. I was as grieved and I wept over the fortunate one as I wept over some other person who's died. It includes a reference to the consoler's obligations to the mourner. I did everything that was fitting, and so did all my people. And then it includes an exhortation to control grief. All the same, one can do nothing in the face of such things. This is a 4th century example. It only has 2 of our 3 themes, but nonetheless, it mentions the consoler's obligations to the mourner. I would have wished to rush to you straight from here, but I can't travel. And then now in a Christian register, this reference to controlling grief. It's necessary to bear the human lot, so put away the grief of human fault and think that nobody among men is immortal except for God. Finally, here is an early Islamic example in Arabic, also lacking the description of grief, but it has this reference to the letters the person wrote. I wrote you several letters, meaning I did what I was supposed to do, but you haven't written me back. And then this, again, call to control grief, quoting several Quranic verses. Indeed, we belong to God, and indeed to him we will return. Everyone on earth perishes, yet the face of your Lord of might and honor remains forever. So this sequence of themes had been around for centuries. But in the Islamic context, the 3rd of these themes, the control of grief, took on special cultural resonance. It is not an accident that it takes up the most space in this early Islamic letter, this blue section here. Karen Bauer has noted that the root hazana, to grieve, appears 42 times in the Quran, and of these, all but 3 of them are negated. As for example, in this surah, whoever truly believes in God and the last day and does good will have their reward with the Lord. There will be no fear for them, nor will they grieve. So in Bauer's words, the main message about grief in the Quran is that one should not grieve because God relieves grief. In medieval Islamic literature, likely the single most central and omnipresent idea about grief, which appears absolutely everywhere, is the value of sabr, a term that we can translate as steadfastness or endurance or forbearance in the face of loss. Avner Giladi has done a great deal of pioneering work on this concept, especially in the Mamluk period. And so to give you a sense of this discourse, I'm just going to quote 2 brief texts that he cites in this article. First, this is an early hadith. Abu Talha's son was ill. When he was out, he died. When the father returned home, he asked, "How is my son?" His wife replied, "He is quieter than he has ever been before." So she doesn't tell him that he's dead. He ate supper and had enjoyment from his wife, meaning they slept together. When he had finished, she said, "Bury the boy," and later she gave birth to a boy. This 14th century text, which is commenting on this story, makes explicit what is implicit in the story by describing it in terms of sabr. This woman showed sabr, she accepted, she acted deliberately, she prepared for herself a reward for her patience. Therefore, God replaced her lost child with a better one. This 14th century text was written in the context of the Black Death in Egypt, which hit Egypt very, very hard, amidst an outpouring of consolation treatises, which Giladi has also written about in several articles. These are works of popular literature that are often not directly about mourning, but that as a genre aimed at, in Giladi's words, channeling the strong emotional reactions of bereaved parents into legitimate religious moods of mourning, that is, into sabr. This concept was shared by Jews living in the medieval Islamic world. It appears in exegetical literature. So, for example, this is how Yefet ben Eli, the most prolific and arguably the greatest Karaite biblical interpreter, explains Job's famous initial response to the death of his children. The Lord gave and the Lord took. May the Lord's name be blessed. Yefet interprets this way, meaning that God is praiseworthy for the good. I've had nothing but beneficence and praise for him, and if he's taken them from me, he's benefited my sabr. So it's not just that steadfastness is an appropriate response, but it's actually a positive virtue to be cultivated, so much so that death can be helpful in helping you cultivate it. Not surprisingly, this same concept shows up all over Geniza condolence letters too. Avraham ben Natan's letter, which we looked at just before, invokes it when he says, "I return to the Creator thankful and steadfast." So the word that I've translated as steadfast here is sabr. This is an especially interesting, undated letter from a brother to his sister after the death of their mother. "As for you, Raisa, have as much sabr as you can. If you wept for 1,000 years, the weeping wouldn't benefit you. You'd only become ill, and no one would die except for you. Oh, my sister, I ask you to restrain yourself," etc. And then he tells her very interestingly, implying that she's literate, to read Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. It will heal your courage. And also he tells her he's sending her this popular work, Relief After Adversity, which is actually a very early pre-Mamluk example, Jewish example of one of these consolation treatises after death. Obviously, all of this talk about steadfastness and forbearance suggests that actually people did mourn the dead, often intensely, and that is not in any way surprising. However, what I think is interesting and unexpected about Geniza condolence letters is that, as we've already seen, these letters consistently invoke the rhetoric of forbearance and endurance while simultaneously describing their own expressive, sometimes uncontrollable grief, and even the pursuit of such expressive grief in a way that is quite different from any earlier corpus of consolation letters that we have from the region. Even this letter, which is entirely consumed with encouraging the sister to have endurance, the brother slips in the fact that he's only writing this note after my eyes have softened with weeping. This juxtaposition is so common in Geniza condolence letters that both responses, an intense focus on the pious repression of grief, alongside an equally intense focus on the performance of grief, seem to me to have comprised a single cultural script, encompassing both of these supposedly contradictory responses side by side, that is novel and particular to this period. That said, I don't believe that it was particular to Jews. I think it was probably a more general cultural phenomenon shared across religious groups. The problem is that we do not have similar condolence letters written by Muslims or Christians in this period. I strongly suspect that if we did, they would look similar. This theme may appear in literary texts, which I have not canvassed yet, but in the meantime, I will make the argument using this tombstone, not from Egypt, but from Yemen, which was published as part of this incredible collection of tombstone texts, The Living and the Dead in Islam. When I called for sabr and weeping, weeping obeyed willingly, but resignation did not obey. So if hope is cut off for you, grief for you will last as long as time lasts. In Geniza letters, this kind of expressive grief sometimes appears in letters about women, sometimes associated with professional wailers, like the ones that Sitt al-Ahl wanted to hire for her funeral. Right, she says Muslims should perform the wailing. For example, this is a fascinating letter written by a man whose grandfather and father have recently died. So it's a bit fragmentary, but he refers to his grandfather's death and his father, may God have mercy on them. And then he then says that his mother, who has thus just lost both her own husband and her own father, she hasn't something from grief and weeping night and day. She has no eye or body left. We are afraid that something may happen to her because anywhere there's weeping, she goes there and won't return until she's fainted. I take this statement, anywhere there's weeping, she goes and won't come back until she's fainted, to refer to funerals or houses of mourning where group wailing, likely including by professional wailers, was taking place. So this woman is literally chasing after the performance of grief to participate in it. And in fact, women's ritual lament is, once again, a very, very old cross-cultural practice with really an extraordinarily long history in the Near East. Wailers are mentioned in the Mishnah as a minimal requirement at a Jewish funeral. So a husband must provide no less than 2 flutes and a wailing woman for his wife at her funeral. And in the Middle Ages, there is extensive evidence from the Geniza and elsewhere that both Jews and Muslims in medieval Egypt worked as and hired professional wailers. Although I should say Sitt al-Ahl's will is the only document I know of that suggests Muslim wailers were kind of like higher quality than Jewish ones. Just to give you some visual interest, this is a thumbnail from an illustration of a funeral from this very, very famous 13th century Iraqi illuminated manuscript showing a female wailer beating her head, which again is an incredibly ancient convention. So this kind of highly demonstrative grief is often associated with women, but surprisingly, it actually does not appear to me to be strongly gendered. Men behave and talk this way too all the time in this material. This is another somewhat famous letter written by a high-ranking Jewish physician describing his response to his brother's death. Of all the clothing I had on, nothing remained except my loincloth and turban, which was half on my head and half thrown in the mud. When I came home, I didn't pass a fireplace or an oven without putting ashes on my head. My senses were completely lost. Then he says that a delegation came from the Sultan to tell him to cut it out. The Sultan has sent us, and this is what he wants to tell you. Accept the loss of your brother as I did when my brother died. The beloved one is a treasure deposited with us by God. The owner takes it back. What can you do? So again, this is our theme of forbearance. But in the next paragraph, he goes on to say that he didn't listen to them. He stayed in bed all day. And then he says, my eye disease came back. I screamed from the fire in my heart and the pain in my eyes. As here, Geniza letters often associate intense grief with a loss of sense perception, either literally from eye disease induced by weeping, which is what I think is going on here in this letter, or more directly, as in Avraham ben Natan's letter, which I started this part of the talk with, to go back to it once again, right? He says, my intellect is almost numb and my mind has fled. This idea, too, seems to have been a key part of the conceptual apparatus surrounding grief that existed in this world. The idea that death created such a rupture for those left behind, not just in the social fabric in which they were embedded, but in their connection to human reality itself, that it interfered with their senses. Only through sabr, forbearance and acceptance of God's will, could sense perception reassert itself, right? I came to myself and withdrew and returned to the Creator, full and steadfast. It seems to me that Geniza Jews express this two-part response, both the extreme grief and its suppression side by side, as both components of what they understood to be a proper and indeed perhaps even pious response to death. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Eve, that was a tour de force of a talk. And for the PhD students watching, that is how you do literary analysis integrated with documentary analysis, integrated with comparative cultural and religious analysis. I literally laughed out loud and I also teared up. So that on top of the of everything else. I want to invite everyone to send in questions through the Q&A. So one aspect of comparative analysis that you didn't do, and I assume this is because this is an early project, was thinking about comparative to practices of Jews and Ashkenaz. And I was wondering if that was something that you'd begun to explore. It's funny, you cited that part from Vayikra, which since I was a child, I always found one of that when Moses tells Aaron, you can't perform grief, literally you will die. And it's always been a very hard passage, I think, for many of us to relate to, because it's like, Aaron had just lost his sons, and it's so I'm wondering if you've had any opportunity to sort of look at if these tropes exist in Ashkenaz in a comparative context, and that goes both for sabr and the concept of forbearance, which, as you said, has pre-Islamic roots as well as for the veneration of the dead body,
Right.
as opposed to the concerns over the purity laws.
Right. No, it's a wonderful question. I have to admit, I really haven't yet. So I just, full disclosure, I've been doing this research and giving talks on it in the margins of writing a book about legal formulary, which is like really not what people want to hear about. It's actually very interesting and important, but it's just very, very dry. So this really is preliminary research, and it's absolutely something I should do. There is, of course, a massive, enormous literature on the veneration of relics in medieval Europe among Christians. And I actually see a real difference. I don't think these people are venerating. It's interesting because, the dead are a source of blessing in Islam also. And yet in the Geniza documents, what I have seen so far is much more a kind of like protective concern for the dead rather than veneration. We do have evidence of kind of visits to holy tombs a little bit that does exist. But when we're talking about like one's relatives or these kinds of everyday deaths, I see much more not veneration as much as sort of care for, which is an interesting difference. But to go back to your question, I have not yet looked at Ashkenaz. I absolutely should. There's some wonderful recent scholarship. Susan Weissman has a book that I have been meaning to read for a long time, and I think there's a recent dissertation on this as well. So it's something I need to do. It's on my to-do list, and if anyone wants to send in comments for suggestions to read, I would be really, really grateful. So the comparative work I've done has been Egyptian and broader Near Eastern context, but I think it is definitely something that I need to do.
I'm excited for that part of the project because I think it will clarify some of the sort of comparative assumptions and questions of not that anything is endogenous to any culture, but the ways in which there's a trans-Mediterranean Jewish, even in European, versus something that's sort of Near Eastern also, and ancient in that sense. Violet Zaitlin asks, isn't there a similar story in the Talmud about a wife, maybe Buriah, not telling her husband in so many words about the death of a son?
There is. Okay, so yeah, again, like I've been doing this research in little bits and pieces over years, but that article by Avner Giladi that I showed engages extensively with kind of the way. Well, first of all, yes, there is. I don't remember now if it's Buriah or someone else, but there is a story like this in the Talmud. There's also conversely a story about a woman who wouldn't stop crying, and then all of her children end up dying as a result. And in that article, Giladi shows how in Judeo-Arabic, Jews writing in the medieval Islamic world kind of repurpose those Talmudic stories so that they are like even more closely in line with the Islamic idea of sabr. So yeah, it is definitely a theme, and you're right, I actually probably should have highlighted that in the talk as well. It is not just an Islamic theme by any means.
Professor Ruth Sandberg asked, Maimonides describes how he was grief-stricken for a year after his brother died at sea. Was his action more a performance following the accepted reaction at hearing about the death of a loved one? Was it his own personal deep grief and not a performance? Maimonides does not strike me as a very emotional person. That is just a guess.
Yeah. So this is such a wonderful example because I think he says in the Mishnah Torah something like, the way you grieve is, I don't remember exactly. You sit shiva for 7 do whatever you're supposed to do for 30 days. And after a year, you're done. And anyone who keeps grieving after this is a fool. And then he writes in one of his own personal letters, exactly as you say, that something like, I'm going to misquote it, but take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But he describes incredible grief. And I think he describes becoming physically ill as a result, and that whenever he sees his brother's handwriting, he has to take to his bed, something like that. I mean, really a kind of very intense grief description that is perfectly in line with what I'm describing in the letters. So I think, I don't think it was idiosyncratic to him at all. I think it was absolutely part of the accepted kind of discourse of grieving. And I should say, when I'm using the word performative, I don't mean to suggest insincerity in any way. I don't see that at all. It's simply that you could feel deep grief and feel that it's, either appropriate to perform it for others or not appropriate. And in this culture, it seems to me, from what I'm seeing in this material, that performing it was, in fact, kind of part of what one was supposed to do with one's grief.
And going back, I mean, the whalers of the Mishnah, I mean, it's an interesting, obviously, uh, deeply rooted. Jen Bailey asked, I'm interested in the use of the term suppressed. It has such negative connotations from our own cultural perspective, the whole package of assumptions about how that impacts the whole person. Is there a more general mode of how emotions work that would have been informing these letters, such as emotions being conscious or unconscious, what the ideal relationship to emotions ought to be, and the relationship between emotions and the body? You can tell this PhD student has a PhD. There's a great.
Yeah. First of all, it's a fantastic question. And I feel very bad. I'm saying to most of you, I just have to still do this research. This is one of the many things that it was not on my to-do list, but you're absolutely right. It should be, to go kind of look at sort of in philosophical works of the period, theory of emotions. This is something I need to do. So I'll get back to you in a decade. But I think actually the truth is that suppression is my word. And maybe I should think more carefully about this, because the words that they use have much more to do with kind of inner strengthening of oneself. They don't talk about suppression. That is something I'm probably incorrectly, now that I think about it, imposing on the material. The discourse here has much more to do with carrying on in the face of grief, endurance, forbearance. There is some kind of even pre-Christian, Greco-Roman material that talks in a more direct way that I've seen about suppression, but that's not, at least in the documents, what I've seen.
That's
but putting aside the very, very big question of kind of literary material that discusses this, which I don't know yet, in the documents, I see no hint that they have a sense that, as we do, that, this kind of endurance harms you in any way, meaning it seems on the contrary that they believe it to be not only necessary, but something that strengthens you, right?
That's a really fascinating question of when we're imposing our own social and cultural norms onto the text. Yeah. I certainly would have the same, the same resonance of using suppression, but that's fascinating. That's a fascinating.
No, it's a great, I'm really grateful for the question, because I try very hard not to do that. And I see, once you asked the question, I realized that actually, no, I was doing that.
I mean, I think it's completely understandable. Please keep sending in questions. I'm going to be selfish and ask one that's relevant to my own research. Pact of Omar, one of the things that's always discussed is Jews and Christians having processions for funerals or weddings, right? And you have this reference in your letter, which is fascinating. I'm going to go straight to that letter after we finish this talk. And I noted the shelf mark, where you have the potential for public violence by Muslims against Jews in response to a funeral procession. Do you see, and obviously when you have whalers, so what the Pact of Omar says, for those who don't know it, is that there's supposed to be Jews and Christians or non-Muslim dhimmis are supposed to conduct themselves with a degree of, maybe sabr is reservation, in the sense of not being overly exuberant in their public rituals, as a sign of a degree of subservience to the realities of their political situation. And so I'm wondering, how do those two things balance? In other words, the sort of public performance of ritual and mourning death, and then and maybe this is about space of Jewish space in the cities, but as you said, Jews and Christians live next to each other with Muslims. So I think there's something really interesting about spatialization here, with the funerals, where the ability to perform the rituals and to perform grief lies in tension with the political social realities of.
No, it's a great question. And okay, for once, I won't say I don't know. I do know, but the answer is we don't know. So that document is kind of a one-off, the one that I spent a lot of time on in Jerusalem, precisely because it's so interesting. There are wailers in the Geniza. There are references to funerals. That is the only reference I know of to, kind of their regulation in that way by the state. And as you know, in general, well, first of all, occasions of kind of public violence, which are better known among Christians, are much more of a phenomenon in the Mamluk period than they are, for the most part, in this 11th, 12th century period. And sort of in general, to what extent the Pact of Umar, so-called, regulations were imposed is a very interesting, fascinatingly complicated question, which I think honestly somebody needs to write, a book on at some point. Not me, but some of them clearly were, others really were not. Others were kind of, again, like a script that was invoked at certain times and not at others. But when it comes to the particular kind of injunction on, in the original text, it's on Christians, kind of having loud funeral processions, is not something that I've seen in the Geniza at all. And there are not really necessarily descriptions of what the funeral looked like, but there are many, many references to large funerals.
So interesting. So interesting. I don't know if there are other questions coming in. Otherwise, I'll just get. I will get into the minutia of Geniza research, and I can do that one-on-one with you in conversation. But this was an exceptionally brilliant talk. If anyone else has any other questions, please send those in. I could not be more excited for the project. Do you have anything else to share about sort of how this fits into sort of the larger research that you're doing and what you're hoping to do with this project in the long term? Because it's so exciting as a one-off. I can only imagine how it fits.
Yeah. So as I said, so my first book was on young women, and then I, for some reason, decided it would be fun to write a book on legal formulary, which it actually has been. I'm really enjoying it. It's a book on how the very standard ways of writing Jewish legal documents, including the ketubah, which we are all familiar with, actually how they developed. And the reason it's an interesting question is that those forms emerge in a very coherent, homogeneous way in the very earliest layer of Geniza evidence we have in the 10th century. And yet before that, for many centuries, we have such little evidence about Jewish history, Judaism at all, that we really have no idea, like we don't have examples of previous documents. So what I'm trying to do is by comparative work, both to kind of ancient Jewish documents and other documentary traditions, to try to understand how this way of writing documents evolved and coalesced. So that's really what I'm spending most of my time on now, but I decided to spare you all from this subject. And this death project, like after finishing this formulary book, I have been more than ready to go back to human beings. And so it's actually a very personal project for me. And I'm, kind of find it very, very powerful whenever I stop and work on it, which I've been doing in kind of little fits and starts. So far what I've done is gather about 100 letters that are either condolence letters, or they have like little passages that are similar to what I showed you within the context of a broader letter, both from mourners themselves and from people sending condolences. I've gathered the more stereotyped Hebrew eulogies. I've gathered legal documents pertaining to burial. I'm not exactly sure what the overall shape of the project, of the book, hopefully, if it is a book, will be once I'm done. But I know that I want it to focus on kind of the care of the dead, not long term, but in the immediate aftermath of death, and ideas about grief. So very much the themes that were in this talk, but there are other facets of it that will come up. And as we were just talking before we got on this talk, my experience with research has always been that like you have no idea what the ultimate shape of it is going to be when you start. But I do hope that a book will come out of it. And there really is very little work on this topic, on the social history of death among Jews, but also broadly in the medieval and Near East. It's an under-researched topic. And what's drawing me to it is, first of all, very deep personal interest in the topic, but also the fact that there is actually all this amazing material. Like when I started gathering these letters, I couldn't believe that nobody had really worked on them before in a serious way, because they're just amazing.
Which is the pleasure of being a Geniza scholar in part, is that there's so much that I mean, I had a thought when you were talking before in response to Jen's question about history of emotions, which it's not an area I'm an expert on at all, but I think this would be a fascinating contribution to that growing field because because of those questions like suppression and grief and
Right.
the extent to which we can talk about this sort of transhistorical phenomenon, because your letters are, people always ask, how do you feel as a Geniza scholar writing about, working on people being thrown in prison or whatever? And I'm like, well, most of the letters are so formulaic. I rarely have like an emotive response to them in the way that your texts actually really do invoke, whether that's a reflection of whatever transhistorical emotional resonance, or it's a completely imagined projection, but there's something there that really does continue to resonate, as you said, in a very personal way. Laura Weinbach wanted to know, can you talk about this is a great nerd's question. I say that as the highest form of praise. Can you talk about the linguistic root of that Arabic word meaning endurance?
Oh, okay. So, I can tell you the semantic range, which now that I'm thinking about it, I'll go back and unchastise myself for saying suppress, because now that I think about it, it does mean to kind of like to bind it literally. Like it also means just forbearance and patience and, endurance, like I said. And then it also means to kind of give up. So that's a very interesting semantic range. Do I know what the linguistic etymology of it is? I do not. That's a great question, worth looking up. But I can look on the various Semitic databases right now. But I don't off the top of my head. No.
Do you know if there's a shared Hebrew? I'm just trying to think.
I can't think of one, but maybe
Yeah.
there is.
That's fascinating. And actually, I think Laura may have just given you an article, because that just with the binding
Right.
association, that's fantastic. Okay, well, thank you, Professor Krakowski. This was such a pleasure. So glad that we could have you at Gratz. We will hopefully have you again very soon, and inshallah.
Oh, sorry. Just one note. It's not a l sound. It's not a lamed sound. It's a resh sound. So it's a different,
right.
Yeah. And it's also the s sound is the tzadi, not the
Right.
Right. Okay. So absolutely. So sorry, I was just answering another comment in the in the chat. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this. It was great. I hope I didn't depress everybody too much. And thank you for your wonderful questions, which really actually gave me a lot of things to think about.
The postmortem shopping trip is one of the funniest analyses of the. I can. So you did a good balance. Thank you again. We were so fortunate to have you, and thank you all for joining us. And I hope many of you come back and watch this again. Thank you.
Thanks.